Hi, and so I was just you kept on sorry, I'm not used to the mic.
It's okay, it's great.
You kept on referencing how your father loved poetry, and you and stuff, had that connection with him through poetry. I was just wondering if and so it was your passion for poetry and stuff stemmed from that connection that you had with your father, and if you see your work as a continual tribute to him in that connection.
Partly, I would say yes to about 70% of both those statements. I didn't really think that I would become a poet when I left my family house and went off to university. I thought poetry was this lovely thing. I knew I had that connection with him, but I never thought that what it would be something I would want to live by. And I want to give credit to other poets, because it wasn't until I got to university and we had the same sort of thing you have here, where they would bring in other poets, either national or international poets. And I remember sitting in a room with the Canadian poet Patrick Lane, and he started to read. And I realized that this wasn't just a private family sort of antiquated thing. This was something people had lived by who I didn't know. And they had made an art out of it. I think what Dad taught me was to revere the poems that existed, and then what the other poets that I later saw in the 4 or 5 years I was at university there, and they kept coming, was to write it. My dad and I had this thing about poetry as an object, but I didn't think I could write it. I didn't think I could venture into it. But then hearing contemporaries or people who were like a generation ahead of me reading their own poetry and writing about lumber mills in British Columbia and urban life in Toronto and all that sort of stuff, then I really got into it and thought, hey, I can actually do this. I'm not just admiring the poem, I'm doing it. So I guess retroactively I realized that Dad was preparing that ground. But there had to be that linchpin of poetry that was connected to my contemporary life, and about things that I lived or about places I knew. So it's a combination for that. And yeah, I think I am paying tribute to him. I think it's funny. I think with The Dying of the Light is the poem that he would always have wanted me to write. But again, that's that trench sense of humor I'm sure he has somewhere that says, see, I had to die, but at least you wrote the poem. It's like, but yeah, I like to think that there is always that element of gratitude to him. Yeah. Somebody else had a question over there. Yeah. Excuse me a second.
So first of all, I want to say that I was in Calgary when that flood was happening. I was flying in.
Oh, wow.
So I got to see the bird's-eye view of all the flooding.
That's amazing. Isn't it stunning?
It was pretty. That was also like my first time in Canada, so that was fun.
Oh, we're a little drier now. Yeah, right. Yeah.
So you did a lot of poems on comic books. So you have, like Jack Kirby, Superman, and Apostrophe. There's a lot of elements to, like, you're related a lot to like Jack Kirby and stuff like that. How much of an influence did these comic book characters have on your career path? Also, other than just your poetry?
Well, I do teach comics and graphic novels, and so I was part of the movement that brought that kind of the actual respect for those art forms into the academy. And for me, it was like secret. It was a secret sin, Like here I am, I could recite Shakespeare, and I'm looking at Hulk versus Glob, right? And that was a contradiction that I lived with by hiding the Hulk part. But when I started to talk about comics with other colleagues and some other were interested in it, I was able to bring that out. And in fact, the comic book taught me how to write the essay. I wanted to be a bit of a comic. Everyone wants to be a comic writer. Everyone who loves them wants to participate. It's the same sort of thing with poetry. You want to participate in what you love, right? And I didn't want to. The thing, if you want to be a comic book artist, you can't just love drawing figures. You have to like to draw cars and buildings and trash cans and whatever. And I didn't like to draw any of that stuff. So, and no one wants to read a comic book with just somebody hopping around with no background. And in fact, the background is very important. You have to have a realistic background to make an unrealistic character look believable. But I would print these comic books and then write little essays about comic books. But since they weren't academic essays, I didn't have to worry about impressing any academics. I just had to talk to other comic book fans. And that really helped with my voice as a writer in both poetry and in the prose. So I've since written some, lots of essays that people actually like to read them. And academic essays have a real problem with you're forced to read them. But it was really shaping in the sense that it connected me to the popular of popular culture. And I thought, well, why not everything? Why not bring all of it? And so there's a superhero reference in all my work. There's always some superhero or comic book reference. And I like to watch how my relationship to those characters changed over time as I'm doing it. Right. There you go. Yeah. Oh, do you want a microphone here? This gentleman here?
I was wondering, what was your ultimate goal when you started writing poetry, and has that goal ever changed? Because some people use poetry as a means of an outlet for their emotions. Other people use it to provide a family history of some sorts. But I was wondering what yours was, since it seems like it's a mix of a lot of different ideas.
Yeah, and it is, because I've been doing this now for 40 years. So the initial motive gets another motive after a while. When I first started to write, I wanted to do exactly what you said, like just talk about my feelings or cope with them or write them out or let you know about them. But that gets exhausted pretty quickly. And you see a lot of people, and that's an important place for the poem, right? Because when you're concentrating on how to say something right, then you concentrate on what you're thinking about that thing. So it can be a very empowering thing, and it can be a very helpful thing. Then I wanted to say other things. I wanted to make an argument or tell you something or enlighten you or whatever. That too is still content driven. Like, I think you start going from being content driven, like this is what I want to say, to more process driven or form driven. More to say, my goal now is just, I want a poem. At the end of this writing, I want a poem. I don't really care what it's about. It'll tell me what it wants to be about. Now, obviously I'm still writing poems that you can tell I'm telling you things. So that initial motivation has never disappeared for me. But why I'm telling you something now is different than why I would have told it to you before. Okay. You have a question.
I don't need a mic. Can I project, right? In our classes, Richard, one of the things we're discussing is the legitimacy of the comic book as art form. And one of the things that our students, some of them have been asking is, what do comic books provide the student of composition or literature that maybe poetry seems to be not fulfilling or addressing? And also,
it's a civil war over here now. Poetry does everything. No, they need a picture. I think partly what the comic book provides. I mean, I teach comic books and I teach the graphic novel as a literary form, and I've seen it now because I've been doing this for quite a while, and you can watch what happens to the dialogue around comic books as it becomes more part of academic life. And, where conversations would have started in, who's stronger, Superman or Thor, they move on to, the sort of semiotic analysis of the evolution of the Superman S as seen in, comics and movies and television shows. It's actually quite an interesting change because it never stood for hope. But now it does, right? And there's reasons for that. Right? There's very interesting reasons for that, social reasons. But you start talking about comic books as if they are high art, and then they have all the virtues and all the failings of high art. And where us, the comic book, geeks would have our own secret knowledge. That's moving away now. Right? And I mean, partly we wanted that. We all wanted that. People, you want what you love to be loved by everyone. There's nothing wrong with that. But as you move into that, you see that your private relationship with it changes when it becomes part of an institution, when it becomes part of media. And that's happened in poetry too, time and again. Poetry is constantly refreshing itself by finding ways of being outside. I was at City Lights bookstore in San Francisco, which I'm sure you know, is the founding home of the beat poets. People like Allen Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti. And again, Bob Dylan used to hang out with them and Lou Reed. And so there was a lot of incredible poetic energy there. But they call themselves the Beats, not because of the little bongo drum that sometimes you'd hear them play. They were the beaten ones. They were beaten up. They were the losers. Actually, when I met Allen Ginsberg, he said to me, he said, what advice should you have? He said, be a loser. Just don't have to worry about winning anything. Don't worry about any of that. Just be a loser. And the Beats were stupendous losers. Right? They were outside mainstream literary culture, which is much more English-driven and formal. Their lines are like loose and wavy and all over the place, very undisciplined. Some of it really works 20 years later, some of it doesn't, but that's fine, doesn't matter. They didn't have to play by anybody's rules. They didn't have to play by anybody's expectation of what a great poem would be. They just didn't care. They were losers anyway. We're never getting in there, so let's just do our own thing. And spoken word, dub, rap, all of that is poetry coming back from the outside of the mainstream culture and saying, hey, this is our truth. Listen up, I'm only going to tell you once. Like, there is that kind of renewal that happens with poetry. And if you stultify, if you don't get that about the nature of the poem, then you don't get what the poem is. And if you don't get that about the nature of the comic is a subversive thing. Like, it was designed to make fun. Like, it's called a comic, right? Its job is to make fun of things. I mean, I think some of what has happened with comics is they've become too serious, right? It's very dark and moody, right? But it's a comic. You're supposed to laugh at something. And the question to ask of a comic is, what am I laughing at? What am I being brought into a position of humor for? And I think that's gotten lost too. And if that's why I want to keep asking that question about comics. And if you ask the question, to answer the question about poetry, if poetry lacks something, I'm just making this up, but I'm liking it. If poetry lacks something, it's out loudness. A lot of people don't do what my dad did, don't do what I do, don't do what rap and dub performers do, spoken word artists do, is speak it out loud. Poetry is meant to be out loud. If you're reading poetry silently, you're reading a comic book with the lights off. Right? You need to pull it off the page. The page is just a remnant. pull it off the page the way you would pull a musical score if you can play an instrument or if you can sing, and you want to know what a song sounds like or a piece of music, you don't want to know what it is, you play it. Same thing with poetry. Play it. Then you'll find what it is. The sound is to the words on the page, poetry, the way the picture is to the script on the page in a graphic novel or comic. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Oh, you got it? Let's see what's it. Oh, mine's relating to that thing. So, based on that, is it kind of a difference thing about poetry already being placed in high art, sort of assumed to be good, versus people are like, oh, I found a rare gem, a good comic book. Is that sort of a thing that comes into play with that? Because usually comics are considered more trashy. Like, I don't know, people are like, oh, you're reading comics, like whatever.
Yeah, I mean, here's the sidebar problem to that, right? Is that with the exception of the great comic purges of the 1940s and 50s, where they actually burned comic books or they pulped them for the war effort, we have all the comics. Like, you can go down to the comic store and you can't possibly read all that in the month that it's going to be fresh, and then a whole another bunch. Like, I think somebody calculated it's like $10,000 worth of comics if you want to buy them a month, and then you read them. But a lot of people don't. But we have all that. So the process of going, well, here's here's Sandman. Let's just pick one we've all heard of. Here's Sandman. That's a great comic. That process, we see the whole process in front of it. So we see the comics that aren't so great, the ones that are young, the ones that are moving along, the ones that are commercially produced for no real apparent reason, the ones that have too much editorial responsibility, etc. We get to winnow out the ones we love. So I have a collection of comics that are totally dear to me. Love them. There's a lot of comics that I wouldn't really want to read. It's not good for me. Poetry, we don't have that. All we have that's left over from the Victorian era is all the stuff that somebody managed to preserve it from the Victorian era. They were producing thousands of pages, but we just don't keep them, so we don't have them. So we do tend to think that all they wrote were just masterpieces. And then now, look at us, we're producing too much. But that's not the way it is at all. When Art Spiegelman, the guy who did Mouse, he came to Calgary, and he had been given the job of arranging for the Museum of Modern Art in New York a comic book display. So he loved comic books, and he's one of the underground comic makers from he was out here, out in the West Coast, and he was faced with this problem in that he would look at a comic page that he loved, and then he would take it and he would walk it over to the wall of the MoMA, and he would look at it on the wall of the MoMA and he would go, that just doesn't work. It works here, but it doesn't work. In the term he used, it wouldn't hold the wall. So in the process of preserving things, we make selections according to the terms and conditions of the place that they're preserved. And some comics are really good for the moment, but they're not good after that. Some poems are really good for the moment, but they're not really good after that. But if you broaden your way of looking at it, going, okay, I mean, I would love it if 100 years from now somebody reads one of my poems and says, this still means something to me. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. But it doesn't diminish what I am now, right? Sorry, this young lady right here, and then, yeah, sorry, I'm just seeing someone behind you there.
In your poem Haiku, you mentioned that experience comes naturally in a poem. So, like, do you feel that the idea of like patience is natural and important when writing poetry as well?
I think there is a natural relationship between experience and the poem. I think you're thinking about the line, experience is to a poem what a belly button is to a mammal. One of my favorite lines. Right? But when you think about, I'm not going to expose a belly button here, but it's right under here, right? Everyone knows where theirs are, right? And if you touch it, it's a little sore. Like it still remembers that it was your life, right? But the rest of you isn't the belly button. The rest of you has come much, much later. The belly button makes life possible, but it doesn't exhaust what life is. You are more than that moment, but there's a necessary moment. So I think for the purposes, the way I think about it, it doesn't matter what you're writing, there's going to be some connection to something you have experienced, because that has shaped the way you view language, it's shaped the way you view talking, it's shaped the way you view other people, and poetry is a communicative act. But to find what that relationship is, that's the patience. And patience, I would love to have patience be easy. Right? I mean, I took 11 years to write this book, and I quit many times. I started some books and then really did drop them. They weren't right. They weren't poems. They were connected to experience, but they weren't poems. So patience comes from the Latin word patior, a patient, like someone in a hospital, same word, and it means to suffer. Patience means to suffer. A patient is a sufferer. Patience, right? Those little poems are waiting there patiently. They're still suffering. They're doing it quietly, but they're doing it. So there is something. Well, when we talk about the passion of the Christ, same word. Passion means to suffer. We take it to mean double-edged. We suffer from love. We can suffer from agony. And poetry is a bit of both. I love what I do, but it anguishes me.
Hi, Richard Harrison. May I call you Mr. Harrison?
You could call me Richard if you like.
Okay. Hi, my name is Roger. By the way, I'm so very happy to meet you finally. Ever since we started reading about you, I've kind of had this little idea that hopefully I get to meet at least one poet that I've read about my whole life. So this is the first poet I meet. You're the first poet I meet.
Thank you.
So I'm very glad to meet you. I wanted to ask you about the poem you wrote about Superman. I'm actually want to be a character designer for Disney Marvel, Disney's Marvel. So I'm studying, humans and things like that. It's always interesting stuff. But the question I wanted to ask you, I'll get right to it. It's just when you compared the Superman looks, when you talked about the jawline, talked about the dad, when he was in his 20s, when you saw that reality as he got older and he got sick, and obviously you were witnessing all these things, mentioning the refrigerator and his constant eating and things like that. When you saw that, do you mind, answering how you felt as comparing to comic books or the comic character, how you expected it to look? How did you feel when you saw that reality in a real human being? Is what I'm trying to ask.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think I love the Superman story. I think Superman remains the most interesting conceptual character in the whole of comics, which is why he's still here after 90 years now? The thing about comic book characters is that they're immortal. And none of us is. Dad had a ruptured ulcer when I was 10. And it was the first time, it was that, we all have that moment, right, where we realize our parents aren't gods. They're not going to live forever. They're not going to know everything. And Dad's ulcer ruptured into his body, and he's bled into his body. And he was taken out from our house, and he was white. His blood had just gone into him. And I remember thinking then, something, I mean, we didn't know whether he would live. He did, of course, but something awful had happened, right? And he was a strong man. He was an athlete. He was a soldier. And I think a lot of my adoration of characters like Superman, Batman, and those sort of things is a displaced or an expanded sense of him. And in a sense, the comic book character is, sort of makes up, the fantasy figure makes up for the flaw in the reality. Right? The failing in the reality is the fantasy figure. And if you're talking about character design, all the characters we love are designed based on real people that the artists admired. And I guess I'm redesigning Superman after my own dad, which again, I hadn't thought about that, but told us now. Gil Kane, the guy who designed the Green Lantern costume and used to draw Captain America, The Flash, he used to say that if you wanted to invent a comic book character, ask yourself what the world lacks. Then go fill it. And I think for a long time, and it comes back to your question again, what's the role of an artistic life, or what's the role of a fantasy relative to the real life, particularly one that you hang on to for a long period of time? And I think in some ways, the superheroic figure, the superheroic body, was a flawless body. And the world lacked that, so I wanted it. But over time, you start realizing that flawlessness and immortality is itself a limitation. It's a kind of prison. And what happens as the body fails, what happens as life changes, what happens as people disappoint you and come back and you forgive them, is that they rise above the fantasy figure. So I would have thought, yeah, I wish my dad was Superman, but really, I wish Superman was my dad. Right? Okay. Thanks for the question.
On that note, I think we're running out of time, Richard, unless there's maybe one more question we have time for.
Right here.
Are you currently working on any other books or works look forward to?
Okay, we'll look forward together. What I traditionally do is after I write a book of poetry, I don't write any more poetry for about a year, because when you have a book, and you know this, right? The book itself will teach you things if you let it, right? Like I'm learning things about it today. So I'm not really working on a new book of poems. I am working on a book of essays. Again, my mother died in July of last year, and she died in a way that you don't have this here yet, but in Canada, you have what's called a medically assisted death, which means that you can die. They can let you go if you're in a condition where you have a terminal illness. And Mom had cancer, and it came to the point where she was looking at sort of 6 months hospice care and suffering, and she didn't want that. So she chose the medically assisted death route, and I was there with her when they did it, when they injected her and she died. And that was tremendously affecting to me for my whole life. And for my whole life, for the rest of my life, it's going to affect me. And it forced me to, I couldn't write a poem. I couldn't quite figure out how to get a poem out of that or get poems out of that. It was sudden. So I've written some essays. There's actually a piece, if you want to look at it, if you're writing on me at all, CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, commissioned a series of pieces by the Governor General's winners on, it was a big question, like order and disorder or something like that. And I chose to write about holding my mother's hand while she was dying. And I realized that as I was holding her hand, there were 2 times when life and death were in perfect balance. One was in her hand, when the drugs were taking her life and life was retreating. There was a moment where it was just half and half. And then when her hand was dead and my hand was alive. So I wrote about that. And that's on CBC Ideas, if you look it up. It's called It Is to That Bedside That I Go. And it's very poetic prose, but it's still, I'm filling things out more that way. The Canadian organization called Dying with Dignity, which advocates for people to have this, has been expanding their work now to talk about people who are like me, who are witnesses, and in some sense participants in this. And so I've been writing a series of short essays about that experience, about what I think it means. And I'm actually doing some work now on looking for old stories that can have meaning for this new experience, because this is a new thing. We've never had this before, where there's been a state-sanctioned, medically sanctioned, scheduled dying. And yet, I think that there's some truths there. There's some really important truths there that older stories have hinted at, and we didn't know how to read them with this in mind, because we weren't doing this. But now we are doing this. So all the contradictions and all the feelings that happen when you're involved in something like that, if they have meaning at all, they're going to connect to something ancient in human storytelling. So I'm busy searching, reinterpreting older stories, fables, biblical stories, that sort of thing, to sort of look for how to make meaning. I think I'll go back to this question. Poetry, art, is about how you make meaning. And I think a poem that lasts, back to your question, I think a poem that lasts is one that continues to make meaning, even under circumstances that its author never considered. And that's what that's what the goal is, to make something that has that openness of meaning, so that when you arrive at it, you realize it's been there all along. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. We appreciate having you here and continuing the MJC Visiting Authors Series. One more time, let's thank our author, Richard. Good night. You can now approach Richard if you'd like to get an autograph or purchase a book.
Hello.